The cabin shook violently. 236 passengers screaming in chaos. An armed group appeared, controlling the cockpit entrance. "This aircraft is changing course. Immediately!" Passengers trembled. Flight attendants stood helpless. Outside, 2 F-22s circled, cold radio voice. "Civilian aircraft. Authenticate now. If not, we must intervene." Passengers panicked, crying, cursing echoing through the cabin. In seat 12F, Elena Carter. Short blonde hair, light blue shirt, fitted black slacks, slowly removed her silver necklace engraved Falcon 214. Her voice rang out over military radio. "Top gun!" Falcon 214. Carter, requesting secure channel. Deadly silence for seconds. Then an F-22 pilot stunned. "Impossible! She once saved my life." Elena Carter, 32 years old, sat quietly in window seat 12F on the transcontinental flight. Her appearance was professional but unremarkable. Short blonde hair, neatly styled, light blue button-down shirt, fitted black slacks that suggested competence without drawing attention. A little girl in the adjacent seat looked up with innocent curiosity. "What do you do for work?" Elena smiled gently. "I used to work with aircraft." The man seated behind them overheard the conversation and burst into dismissive laughter. "Aircraft? You think you're Top Gun or something? Women don't know anything about fighter jets." A young man nearby joined in the mockery. "Yeah, right. Probably just a secretary at some airline company." Several passengers chuckled, turning Elena into the subject of their entertainment. The atmosphere around her became thick with condescending amusement, as if her quiet confidence was somehow pretentious. Elena remained silent, her fingers gently touching a silver necklace bearing the inscription Falcon 214. Her eyes showed a flicker of sadness, but she chose not to engage with the provocation. The little girl whispered admiringly, "That's so pretty." Elena replied softly, "It was my father's." An elderly woman in the seat ahead turned slightly. "Falcon. I heard that call sign at Miramar back during the Top Gun days." Elena simply smiled quietly, gazing out at the endless blue sky, choosing not to correct anyone's assumptions or defend herself against their mockery. The man who had initially mocked her continued his commentary. "See? Just another woman with delusions of grandeur. Probably watched too many movies about pilots." Other passengers joined in with similar comments, finding humor in what they perceived as Elena's inflated sense of importance. To them, she was clearly someone trying to seem more significant than she actually was. But Elena's calm demeanor never wavered. She had learned long ago that some people needed to diminish others to feel better about themselves, and arguing rarely changed minds that were already closed. The silver pendant caught the cabin light occasionally, revealing intricate military engravings that spoke of official authorization rather than decorative jewelry. But none of the passengers bothered to look closely enough to notice these details. Throughout the verbal assault, Elena maintained her composure with the quiet dignity of someone who had nothing to prove to strangers. Her confidence came from experience, not from the need for validation from people who had already decided what to think about her. The elderly woman continued studying Elena with growing interest, recognizing something in her bearing that reminded her of military personnel she had encountered decades earlier. There was a stillness about Elena, a way of processing information that suggested she was far more than she appeared. As the aircraft continued its journey across the country, conversations moved to other topics. and Elena faded back into anonymity. But she remained alert, her training having taught her to always be aware of her surroundings and potential threats. The mockery had stung, not because she cared about their opinions, but because it reminded her of the challenges she had faced throughout her military career. Being underestimated because of her gender was nothing new, but it never became easier to endure. She touched her father's pendant one more time, drawing strength from the legacy it represented. He had taught her that actions spoke louder than words, and that the right moment to prove yourself would always come to those who were prepared. Outside the aircraft windows, the sky stretched endlessly in all directions, beautiful and peaceful. But Elena's trained eye occasionally caught glimpses of distant aircraft, routine military patrols that most passengers would never notice. Her quiet vigilance was about to prove more valuable than anyone could have imagined. Midway through the flight, an armed group suddenly stood up throughout the cabin, revealing weapons that had somehow passed through security screening. The coordinated nature of their movements suggested extensive planning and professional training. They moved swiftly toward the cockpit, overwhelming the flight attendants with practiced efficiency. Within seconds, they had gained control of the aircraft's command center, forcing the first officer to alter course at gunpoint. Screams erupted throughout the cabin as passengers realized they were experiencing a hijacking. Children cried for their parents. Adults shouted questions that no one could answer. And the atmosphere shifted from routine travel to life-threatening emergency. One of the armed men addressed the cabin with cold authority. "From this moment, this aircraft belongs to us. Anyone who interferes will be eliminated." The threat was delivered with the casual confidence of someone accustomed to violence, sending waves of terror through passengers who had been peacefully reading or sleeping just moments earlier. Outside the aircraft, military radar installations detected the sudden course deviation and loss of communication with air traffic control. Standard protocols immediately went into effect, dispatching 2 F-22 fighters to intercept and assess the situation. The radio crackled with official military authority. "Civilian aircraft, authenticate your status immediately. Failure to comply will result in defensive measures." The implication was clear but unspoken. If the aircraft was confirmed to be under hostile control, military pilots were authorized to shoot it down to prevent it from being used as a weapon against ground targets. Passengers throughout the cabin began to understand the full scope of their situation. They weren't just being hijacked. They were potentially facing destruction by their own military forces if proper identification couldn't be established. The man who had earlier mocked Elena's claims about aircraft experience now shouted in panic, "See? Where's your Top Gun now? We're all just civilians here." His earlier arrogance had completely dissolved into terror as he realized that his dismissive attitude toward others wouldn't help him in a real crisis. The jokes about women and aviation expertise seemed pathetically irrelevant now. Elena gripped her father's pendant tighter, her mind automatically shifting into tactical assessment mode. Years of training had prepared her for exactly this type of situation, though she had never expected to face it as a civilian passenger. The hijackers were communicating with each other in brief, coded phrases that suggested military or paramilitary background. Their positioning throughout the cabin was strategic, designed to prevent passenger resistance while maintaining control of critical aircraft systems. But Elena noticed something the other passengers missed. The hijackers were nervous. Despite their show of confidence, they kept glancing at their watches and checking the windows, as if they were operating under time pressure or waiting for something specific to happen. The radio transmissions from the F-22s were becoming more insistent. Aircraft, you have 60 seconds to provide authentication codes, or we will assume hostile intent. Flight attendants tried to maintain calm, but their training hadn't prepared them for this level of crisis. The normal procedures for dealing with difficult passengers were completely inadequate for armed hijackers with apparent military experience. Some passengers began praying. Others tried calling loved ones on their cell phones, and a few attempted to hide in the restrooms. But there was nowhere to go and no way to escape from an aircraft traveling at 35,000 feet. The little girl who had been sitting next to Elena began crying, reaching for her hand. "I'm scared. Can you help us?" Elena looked into the child's eyes and made a decision that would change everything. She had spent years in retirement, avoiding situations that would require her to reveal her military background, but 236 innocent lives now depended on capabilities that only she possessed. The hijackers were focused on maintaining control of the cockpit and monitoring passenger compliance. They hadn't paid particular attention to the quiet woman in seat 12F, assuming she was just another terrified civilian. That assumption was about to prove catastrophic for their operation. Elena's training kicked in automatically, her mind cataloging the positions of all hostile targets, calculating angles of approach, and assessing the most effective ways to neutralize threats while protecting innocent passengers. But first, she needed to prevent the F-22s from shooting down the aircraft. The military pilots outside had no way of knowing that passengers were still alive and in control of their own actions, unless someone with proper credentials could establish communication. The silver pendant around her neck wasn't just a family keepsake. It was a functioning military identification that carried authorization to communicate directly with fighter pilots and command centers. Elena had hoped never to use it again. But circumstances were forcing her hand. The woman who had been mocked for claiming knowledge about aircraft was about to demonstrate exactly how much she really knew. The radio crackled again. "Final warning. Aircraft. Authenticate immediately or face the consequences." Time was running out, and Elena realized that her fellow passengers' survival depended on her willingness to reveal capabilities she had kept hidden for years. She stood up slowly, her movements careful and non-threatening to avoid alarming the hijackers, and began walking toward the front of the cabin where the communication equipment was located. The moment of truth had arrived. Elena rose from seat 12F with the fluid confidence of someone who had been trained for crisis situations. Her movement was deliberate, but non-threatening, designed to avoid triggering aggressive responses from the armed hijackers while positioning herself to access the aircraft's communication systems. Several passengers tried to stop her. "Are you crazy? Sit down before they shoot you." But Elena continued forward with quiet determination, her training having taught her that hesitation in critical moments could cost lives. She had made her decision, and now she needed to execute it flawlessly. She calmly connected her personal headset to the aircraft's radio system, entering emergency military frequencies with the precision of someone who had used these protocols many times before. Her voice, when she spoke into the microphone, carried absolute authority. Top Gun Control. Falcon 214. Carter requesting immediate secure channel access. The effect outside the aircraft was immediate and electric. Radio chatter that had been building toward a shoot-down order suddenly went completely silent, as if every pilot and controller in the region was holding their breath. Then, from one of the F-22 pilots, came a voice filled with emotion and disbelief. "My God, it's really you, the pilot who pulled me out of that stall at Miramar. You saved my life. Command Control's voice crackled through with obvious confusion. Falcon 214. That's a classified operation code. Switching to priority red channel immediately. Air Force bases throughout the region immediately implemented emergency protocols reserved for the highest levels of military authority. The call sign Elena had just used carried weight that transcended normal rank structures, representing capabilities and clearances that most officers never encountered. The F-22 pilot's voice came through again, this time broadcasting on general frequencies for everyone to hear. All units, cease targeting procedures. We are now escorting Falcon 214. Repeat. Escorting Falcon 214. The transformation in the cabin was instantaneous and complete. Passengers who had been mocking Elena just hours earlier now stared at her in stunned amazement, finally understanding that the woman they had dismissed was someone with authority that reached into the highest levels of military command. The man who had ridiculed her claims about aircraft expertise was now pale and speechless, unable to meet anyone's eyes as he realized the magnitude of his error in judgment. The hijackers, who had been monitoring radio chatter, suddenly understood that they had made a catastrophic miscalculation. The quiet woman in seat 12F wasn't just another passenger. She was someone with direct access to military forces that could destroy their entire operation. One of the armed men moved toward Elena, but she spoke without turning around. I wouldn't recommend that course of action. Her voice carried a quiet authority that made him pause, recognizing something in her tone that suggested she was far more dangerous than she appeared. Through the aircraft's communication system, Elena began coordinating with military control. Request immediate tactical assessment. Civilian aircraft under hostile control. 236 souls on board, requiring protection. The response was comprehensive and immediate. Falcon 214. Full military assets at your disposal. Special operations teams standing by. What do you need? The hijackers realized that their carefully planned operation was disintegrating. They had prepared for resistance from flight crew and passengers, but they hadn't anticipated encountering someone with Elena's capabilities and connections. Elena continued her coordination with military forces. Hijackers are armed but nervous. Suggest psychological pressure rather than direct intervention. Passengers are in immediate danger if situation escalates. Her tactical assessment was being broadcast to command centers throughout the military aviation network, with senior officers who remembered the Falcon 214 operations from years earlier now providing direct support. The little girl who had been sitting next to Elena watched with wide-eyed amazement as the quiet woman transformed into someone commanding respect from fighter pilots and military commanders. One of the F-22 pilots made his admiration clear over the radio. Falcon 214. It's an honor to fly escort for you again. Standing by for your instructions. The elderly woman who had recognized Elena's call sign earlier nodded with deep satisfaction. Her instincts about the quiet passenger completely vindicated. Throughout the cabin, passengers were beginning to understand that they were witnessing something extraordinary. The woman they had dismissed as delusional was coordinating a military response with the same ease that others might order coffee. Elena's next transmission demonstrated her tactical brilliance. All units maintain escort positions but do not engage unless specifically authorized. Psychological pressure only. Let them understand their situation has changed. The hijackers could hear the military coordination through their own monitoring equipment and were beginning to realize that their operation was now facing opposition from someone who understood their tactics better than they understood hers. Radio confirmation came from multiple military frequencies. Falcon 214. Psychological pressure campaign initiated. Hostile targets are now isolated and contained. The man who had mocked Elena's military knowledge now sat hunched in his seat. His earlier arrogance completely evaporated as he witnessed her demonstrating capabilities that exceeded anything he could have imagined. Elena's calm professionalism throughout the crisis showed years of training and experience that couldn't be faked or learned from movies. She was the real deal, and everyone aboard was beginning to understand exactly what that meant. The hijackers' confidence was visibly eroding as they realized they had encountered opposition they hadn't planned for. Their nervous glances and whispered conversations suggested they were considering surrender rather than escalation. Through the windows, passengers could see the F-22 escorts maintaining perfect formation. A visible reminder that the quiet woman in the blue shirt had just called in the full power of the United States military to protect them. Elena's voice remained calm and professional as she continued coordinating the response. All stations, maintaining passenger safety is priority 1. Tactical solutions secondary. Acknowledge. The response from military command was immediate. Copy Falcon 214. Passenger safety priority. All units standing by for your command. The transformation was complete. The woman who had been subjected to mockery and dismissal was now commanding respect from the most elite military pilots in the world, while 236 passengers watched in amazement. The hijackers were discovering that their carefully planned operation had encountered an obstacle they couldn't overcome. Someone whose training and connections exceeded their own capabilities. Outside the aircraft, the sky was no longer empty. It was filled with military assets responding to Elena's call, ready to ensure that every passenger made it home safely. The aircraft landed safely under full F-22 escort, with specialized military teams waiting on the tarmac to handle the hijackers who had surrendered during the psychological pressure campaign. All 236 passengers were evacuated without injury, an outcome that would have been impossible without Elena's intervention. As passengers gathered their belongings and prepared to disembark, the atmosphere in the cabin had fundamentally changed. The mockery and dismissal from earlier in the flight had been replaced by respectful gratitude and genuine amazement. The little girl who had been sitting next to Elena ran up and hugged her tightly. "You saved all of us, didn't you?" Elena knelt down to the child's level and smiled warmly. "We all stayed strong together." That's what mattered most. The head flight attendant approached with tears in her eyes, gripping Elena's hand firmly. 236 people will remember this for the rest of their lives. Thank you. Elena's response was characteristically modest. The flight crew kept everyone calm during an impossible situation. That takes real courage. The man who had ridiculed her throughout the early part of the flight approached hesitantly, his face red with embarrassment and shame. I owe you an apology. I was completely wrong about everything." Elena simply nodded acknowledgement, her response gracious but brief. "We all make assumptions sometimes. What matters is that everyone is going home to their families." Her handling of both the crisis and its aftermath demonstrated the same professionalism she had shown during the emergency, focused on results rather than recognition, outcomes rather than personal vindication. Passengers began approaching Elena with expressions of gratitude, but she politely deflected most attempts at extended conversation, preferring to maintain her privacy and return to civilian life as quickly as possible. Airport security and military personnel maintained a respectful distance, understanding that Elena's civilian status required careful handling despite her demonstrated capabilities. She was escorted through the terminal with minimal disruption, allowing her to continue her journey without unwanted media attention. The transformation extended beyond just respect for Elena. Passengers who had witnessed the event found themselves questioning their own assumptions about the people around them, wondering what hidden capabilities and experiences surrounded them in their daily lives. Social media posts began appearing as passengers shared their experience, though most were careful not to reveal specific details about Elena's identity or military background. The hashtag Falcon Saves 236 began trending, with grateful travelers sharing stories about hidden heroes and unexpected courage. Parents used the experience to teach their children about respect and the importance of not judging people based on superficial characteristics. The lesson about assumptions and stereotypes had been delivered in the most dramatic way possible. Military personnel at the airport spoke in hushed tones about the Falcon 214 incident, understanding that they had witnessed the return of a legend that many had thought was retired forever. The call sign carried historical significance that transcended normal military protocols. Flight crews began sharing the story throughout the aviation community, recognizing that they had been part of something that would be studied and remembered for years to come. Elena's tactical coordination during the crisis had prevented what could have been a devastating tragedy. The elderly woman who had recognized Elena's call sign earlier made a point of speaking with her before leaving. "I knew there was something special about you. Thank you for proving that heroes are still among us." Elena smiled and replied simply, "Heroes are everywhere. They just don't always announce themselves." As Elena finally prepared to continue her journey, she reflected on how a routine flight had become a reminder that some skills and responsibilities never truly retire. They simply wait for the moment when circumstances require them again. The following morning, news outlets carried only brief reports. Commercial flight lands safely after emergency. All passengers and crew unharmed. The true story of Falcon 214's return to action remained classified, known only to the 236 passengers who had witnessed it firsthand. Military historians quietly updated classified records, noting that certain call signs carried authority that transcended retirement and civilian status. The Falcon 214 operations from decades earlier had produced capabilities that remained valuable even outside active service. Several weeks later, Elena received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a handwritten letter from the F-22 pilot, whose life she had saved during training at Miramar years earlier. "If you ever have the opportunity, please teach me again, because long ago, you taught me how to survive. Now, you've taught me what true courage looks like in civilian life." Accompanying the letter was a small gift from the little girl who had sat beside her during the flight. A paper bracelet with childish handwriting spelling out 214, my hero. Elena held both items carefully, her eyes filling with tears as she realized that her actions had created connections that would last far beyond the immediate crisis. She walked out onto her apartment balcony, looking up at the endless sky, where the sound of distant jet engines carried on the wind like a greeting from old friends. The silver pendant rested against her chest, no longer just a family keepsake, but a reminder that some legacies are meant to be used when lives depend on them. Elena had returned to her quiet civilian life, working at a small aviation consulting firm where her colleagues knew her as a detail-oriented professional with an unusual depth of technical knowledge. None of them suspected her military background, but the passengers from Flight 236 would never forget what they had witnessed. Children who had been on board would grow up understanding that heroes come in unexpected forms, and adults would carry the lesson about assumptions and respect throughout their lives. Aviation forums and military blogs discussed the incident in coded language, recognizing that certain individuals possessed capabilities that commanded instant recognition across all branches of service. The man who had mocked Elena's claims about aircraft expertise found that the experience had changed him fundamentally. He began approaching interactions with more humility, having learned that competence and authority don't always announce themselves with fanfare. Elena kept both the letter and the paper bracelet in a small box beside her father's military decorations. Reminders that the Falcon legacy continued to make a difference even in retirement. Sometimes, while working late at her consulting firm, she would hear military aircraft passing overhead and remember that somewhere in the sky, pilots she had trained or rescued were still serving, still protecting people who would never know their names. Message: those you dismiss today as ordinary may carry extraordinary legacies, and when crisis comes, they will be the ones who step forward to save everyone. CTASN Quiet Stories. If you believe in stories that touch the heart like this one, leave a comment. And don't forget to subscribe to SN Quiet Stories. We tell the stories that shouldn't be forgotten. Real people are creating and telling stories, not mass-produced AI.